Everybody, my name is Alexis Fernandez, and I am the CalFresh Policy Bureau Chief here at CDSS CalFresh and Nutrition Branch. I'm joined today by Aubrey Bisco, who's our lead disaster CalFresh analyst. So over the last week or so, we have been working closely with your disaster response team to identify response options as they relate to issuing additional food benefits to households impacted by the disaster. And with our recent approval from the Federal Food and Nutrition Service, we are now transitioning from planning to implementation. I'm sure you all are well aware. So we are going to take a deep dive into eligibility policy today. I had hoped to be there live and in person, but we had a couple other meetings this morning here in Sacramento, so we are joining by the phone. That said, I do hope to keep this as casual as possible, so we have time at the end for question and answer, but we'll be pausing throughout the presentation, and Melanie will jump in if there are questions in the room. So she is acting as my eyes today, but of course you could interrupt me. And then just if we're not able to answer questions live, we will write them down and we'll do any necessary research to get your team an answer in writing very quickly, as we know that Wednesday is just around the corner. But what you'll see is, you know, we are all, and you the same as us, very comfortable with regular CalFresh eligibility policy. This is a little different than what we do day to day. We'll be highlighting those differences today, but it also means that sometimes people come up with tricky scenarios that require some additional research. So we will make time for that as well. Before we get into the nitty-gritty, I do just want to say thank you and take a moment to do that here in advance for the work that you're about to do to make this happen. We recognize it takes an extraordinary amount of time and energy on your part. We have the luxury of being in Sacramento while you guys are on the ground making this happen, and we appreciate your commitment. We've seen in other communities across the state this last year that it really does have a great impact on individuals and families. So thank you for making that happen. With that, we'll go ahead and get started. I'm going to hand it off to Aubrey, and he is going to highlight some general disaster CalFresh background information, some general concepts that we're going to mention throughout the training. We'll take a pause before getting into eligibility specifics, but these terms and dates that we're going to address are really critical as we move through the slides. So Aubrey, we will start with the basics of what is disaster CalFresh.
All right, thanks Alexis. Hi everyone. So what is disaster CalFresh? First off, even to request CalFresh, an affected area must have received a presidential declaration for individual assistance, or how you might hear it referred to sometimes as IA. And there are many different kinds of presidential declarations, but again, the one that we need for CalFresh is individual assistance. CalFresh provides temporary food assistance for households impacted by a natural or man-made disaster, in this case, the Carr Fire. The program provides temporary benefits to eligible disaster survivors while also facilitating the issuance of supplemental CalFresh benefits for ongoing or existing households. To be eligible for CalFresh, a household must have lived or worked in the identified disaster area at the time of the disaster, which in Shasta County is July 23rd, Carr Fire start date. They also must have been affected by the disaster, meaning some type of adverse effect, and must also meet certain CalFresh eligibility criteria, which we will, of course, cover later on in this presentation. So moving forward to CalFresh household composition, the household composition for CalFresh is established on the date the disaster struck. So for this particular event, the official start date of the Carr Fire was July 23rd, 2018, per the presidential declaration. A household includes those people living, purchasing, and preparing food together at the time of disaster. It does not include those people who are temporarily staying with the applicant because of the disaster. Also, CalFresh households may not be familiar with what it means to, quote, purchase and prepare food together. And in Shasta County, you need to be conscious of that whenever you're interviewing potential disaster CalFresh households. And the same could be true for a lot of the terminology that our normal CalFresh households and you workers are familiar with, but our CalFresh households may not be. So try to provide clarity when you think it might be needed, especially because the client may not always speak up or ask questions. Do note, members excluded from the CalFresh household as of the date the disaster struck may be eligible for CalFresh, and we'll discuss that excluded members later on in this presentation as well. So, disaster CalFresh application period. The county can only accept CalFresh applications from new households and requests for supplements from ongoing households during the CalFresh period. And in Shasta County, the application period will be operational for 7 non-consecutive days during August 22nd through the 25th and August 27th through the 29th. In general, county offices should not begin accepting applications until public information and outreach has begun. Staff have been trained, resources are in place, and some of which include adequate application sites, human comforts, and especially not until state systems are ready to begin CalFresh processing and issuance.
And I will just jump in to confirm that we've been working very carefully with your disaster response team to make sure all of that is in place in advance of August 22nd. So client communication is underway, the systems will be ready, and of course you've selected your own offices as application sites, so that's all taken care of ahead of Wednesday.
Looking at the CalFresh benefit period, which is going to be July 23rd through August 21st, which is 30 days tied to the start date of the car fire. The benefit period is critical to determining CalFresh eligibility, and it's the time period which disaster-related expenses may be counted and the start date used to determine household composition. Only income, resources, and expenses during the benefit period are considered in determining disaster CalFresh eligibility. So, assisting ongoing CalFresh households during disaster CalFresh. For parity, the county will issue individually requested or automatic supplements to ongoing CalFresh households during the application period. They can also issue supplements to ongoing households whose benefits were previously replaced as a result of the same disaster. So, it is conceivable that an ongoing household could receive replacement benefits in addition or as well to receiving replacement benefits, either individually or automatically.
Let me, just to correct that sentence, so you could receive replacement and supplemental benefits. That's a typo on our part.
The amount of a supplement is equal to the difference between the maximum allotment for their household size and the household's regular CalFresh allotment. So if you have an ongoing CalFresh household who receives $150 a month in benefits, but the maximum allotment size for a household of one is $192, that ongoing household would get that difference, which is $42. It brings them up to the maximum allotment. It's an equity fee. As a reminder, an ongoing CalFresh household may call the office to request an individual supplement. When that occurs, the county can mail the household a CS-303 to be signed and returned within 10 days before issuance. And I will give it back to Alexis.
So before we go on to basic disaster CalFresh eligibility, I'll just do a pause here in the room to see if there are any questions about what disaster CalFresh is, how general household composition is determined, or these very critical definitions for an application period and the benefit period. Melanie, are there any questions in the room?
No. Oh, yes, one.
As far as the resources go, if we're looking at bank balances.
That will be covered later, Brian, so hold that question. We can go ahead.
Okay, great. So thank you, Aubrey. We're now going to get into disaster CalFresh eligibility. So in general, to be eligible for disaster CalFresh, a household cannot already be receiving CalFresh. They would be eligible for a supplement. We've already mentioned excluded members. They have special rules. We will get to that. But in general, when we're talking about disaster CalFresh, we're talking about households who have not already received regular CalFresh benefits. So before we dive into the 3 criteria, I do think there's also another important point to be made here, in that these are the 3 basic eligibility criteria. So the first level, if you will, eligibility criteria. That is, you must determine that these 3 criteria, which we're about to go through, are met before you proceed to determining whether the household meets financial eligibility criteria. So we are first going to talk about the 3 basics, and then we're going to talk about the financial eligibility specifics. So the 3 basic eligibility criteria. The first is residency. The household must have lived or worked in the disaster area at the time of the disaster. So in this case, the disaster area is all of Shasta County, and the quote-unquote time of the disaster is tied to that July 23rd start date. So you have to have lived or worked in the county on July 23rd. Second, you have to plan on purchasing food during the disaster benefit period. So that period is July 23rd through August 21st. You have to have planned to purchase food during that period. Now, that is most households. The only common reason that someone would not meet this requirement is if they're staying in a shelter where food is provided to them for the entire length of the benefit period. The third category, which is where we're going to spend some additional time, is an adverse effect. Your household had to have experienced a negative effect or negative impact as a result of the disaster. This includes food loss. We're going to talk a little bit about what else it might include. So let's dive into these adverse effects. The first is a loss of income or inaccessibility of income. So the adverse effect is pretty common, as lost or inaccessible income includes a reduction or termination of income. In other words, a loss of work or a delay in receipt of income, both during the benefit period. So as a result of the disaster, between July 23rd and August 21st, you lost income or did not receive income because maybe your employer was unable to pay income that was owed to you. So remember, for this particular event, we're again looking back to that key benefit period, July 23rd to August 21st. The next category of adverse effect is inaccessible liquid resources. And liquid resources is a fancy name for cash on hand. This adverse effect is rare, as it requires that cash on hand is actually inaccessible during the benefit period. So a common example, not from California, but from other states, is that banks are closed due to the disaster during the benefit period. So we saw this happen in Texas and Louisiana due to hurricanes. Households usually can access their resources via online banking or ATMs, even if bank branches are closed. So again, this is rare. I will say that in past wildfires, what we have seen is that households whose homes have burned down have lost cash on hand if they were keeping it at home instead of in the bank. So while rare, you might still run across this situation. It's good to keep it in mind. The third category of an adverse effect, and possibly the most common, is going to be deductible disaster-related expenses. So as the name suggests, these are out-of-pocket disaster expenses incurred and paid during the benefit period. So emphasis on the phrase incurred and paid. The household must have actually paid the expense during the benefit period. So a good example here is if a household charged a disaster-related expense on their credit card, like a hotel stay, but did not pay it during the benefit period, that expense would not qualify. Now, I recognize this is a very stringent definition of a disaster expense, but we are constrained by federal guidance. So on this particular policy point, it does have to be incurred and paid. We're going to take a look next at some common expenses, just to give you a sense of what would qualify. So some eligible expenses may include, but are not limited to, home or business repairs, temporary shelter expenses such as the cost of a hotel, evacuation expenses including things like gasoline, home or business property protection, medical expense due to personal injury as a result of the disaster, pet boarding fees, expenses related to replacing personal and household items such as clothing, appliances, tools, or educational materials, vehicle expenses if they were damaged in the disaster, and storage expenses. I will say that this list we have found requires some exploration on your part during the interview to ensure that the household understands the full breadth of allowable deductible expenses. This is a little bit different than our normal CalFresh rules, and households may not be aware of all the things they could tell you about, so you will want to explore these expenses as you interview the client and determine their eligibility. And we'll spend a little bit more time on that. In addition to lost income, inaccessible resources, and disaster-related expenses, food loss alone may also qualify a household for disaster CalFresh. So because this is your first level eligibility, food loss alone is basically like the screener. If you pass that test, you're in, but we still have to determine that you are financially eligible. So food loss is one of these initial eligibility criteria, regardless of whether it's food loss or an adverse effect or loss of income, the household still has to be determined income eligible, and we're going to talk more about that in just a minute. So now that we understand some of these basic eligibility criteria, and before we dive into details around the application, the interview, income limits, and so on, I'm going to take just a minute to circle back on the topic of excluded household members. We did see quite a few cases with excluded household members in Northern California and Ventura and Santa Barbara. And the reason for that is that those households were already familiar with CalFresh. There were already household members getting CalFresh, and so the word spread quickly and they were familiar with the county. So we did receive quite a few applications from households with excluded members. So the regular restricted eligibility criteria for CalFresh, which include but are not limited to student status, citizenship status, IPVs, work registration sanctions, those restrictions do not apply to disaster CalFresh. So the previously excluded member may be eligible for disaster CalFresh. The excluded household member must apply for the CalFresh separate and apart from the ongoing household, because the ongoing household may be eligible for a supplement. So we're going to talk a little bit about these combination scenarios, but at this point, just to highlight that they exist, and we should not be turning excluded members away. Okay, let's just take a moment to do an overview of the application. For this disaster, we will accept disaster CalFresh applications, the CS-385, or requests for supplements on the CS-303, only during the application period. The DCalFresh must be the DCalFresh application must be submitted in person, and the supplement request can be submitted either in person or by phone. An important note here that the CS-303 is the go-to form for requesting a supplement, but if an ongoing household accidentally completes a CS-385, so they're only eligible for supplements, but they apply for all of DCalFresh, please do not make the household complete an additional 303. Instead, go ahead and use the 385 application to issue the supplement. We've just seen that some people they get confused about what they have to fill out, and we don't want to make them duplicate efforts. So if you accidentally get a 385 from an ongoing CalFresh household, you can use that to issue a supplement. This is also a good time to highlight one important rule that is specific to disaster CalFresh, and that is that A DCalFresh applicant household may also qualify for regular CalFresh. For example, you find out from a client that they lost their job indefinitely and they really don't know when they will have additional income, and the long-term support of CalFresh may be for them. They should be encouraged to apply for regular CalFresh and disaster CalFresh. It is great to get them onto that more long-term stable support. But it's important to remember that if a household applies for regular CalFresh and disaster CalFresh, that must happen separately. So the same worker cannot process the disaster CalFresh application and the regular CalFresh application at the same time. So the household, unfortunately, must do 2 separate applications, 2 separate interviews, 2 separate verification submissions with 2 separate workers. And I know that seems quite tedious, but the feds are very clear. We need to keep disaster CalFresh separate from regular CalFresh. So for the interview, one additional uniquely challenging requirement of disaster CalFresh is that the interview must be conducted in person. So there are some provisions to consider for servicing a elderly individual or person with disabilities, and that is that they can designate an authorized representative to apply on their behalf, but the AR must come in person to apply. And we use all of the existing AR requirements, so they can be designated and sign on behalf of that person, but they have to apply in person for the individual with a disability or the elderly individual. Just a couple of other reminders here about the interview, and Aubrey alluded to this already, but because some of the disaster CalFresh households may not have previously applied for CalFresh or have been familiar with CalFresh, the interview process and the basic eligibility concepts might be foreign to them. So you may have to, as an eligibility staff, spend a little bit more time during that interview explaining some of these new concepts and how benefits work, etc. Just keep that in mind. As well, disaster-impacted households that have experienced extensive loss have sometimes difficulty completing the interview just because you're asking them to rehash what could be very difficult conversations. When you're discussing disaster-related expenses, inevitably you're going to discuss, an evacuation or a home loss. And so what we've seen in other areas is that this just can be difficult and require some additional time. So just be ready and kind of aware that that might be a need amongst this population. So like for regular CalFresh, and this is the interview section continued, we need to try to do our best to ensure applicant privacy to the extent possible. So I know it can get a little busy in the offices while we're operating DCalFresh, but you want to try to maintain privacy as much as you can in that environment. During the interview, the eligibility worker is determining whether the household meets the basic or first level eligibility criteria, and then will eventually establish financial eligibility and collect verification. So to this end, we've listed some issues or questions that the EW might tackle. For household composition, you can ask for the proof of identity for the head of household, confirm names and birthdays of other household members, and simply ask what the household composition was on the day that the disaster struck. So again, on July 23rd. For residency in the disaster area, you could use some flexibility here, but typical residency verifications, the ID, bills, library cards, things like that. It's broadly residency in Shasta County. And not to jump ahead, but my bullets are not ordered correctly, and I will just say on the next slide, what it mentions that when someone is telling you that they were employed in the area, so they're not residents, but they were employed in the area, you can just ask for some details around their place of employment and who in the household was employed in Shasta County. You'll also want to ask about income and whether it's available and anticipated during the benefit period, and we're going to talk more about what timelines to use for that. But in addition to income, you'll ask about resources available at the start of the benefit period. You'll ask about the impacts of the disaster on the household. So things like, what adverse effects did the household suffer? How much did they pay or anticipate to pay during the benefit period for those expenses? How did they pay for these expenses? So remember, only expenses paid out of pocket and not merely incurred are countable. And you'll want to find out if they plan to receive reimbursement for any of these expenses, because as you'll see in the next few slides, all of these questions will impact your financial eligibility calculation. Before I get to the disaster gross income limit test and how that works, I'll pause here, Melanie, and see if there are any questions in the room.
Scott?
You mentioned credit cards. A lot of people, I know I use a check card that's attached to my checking account, but in some cases it's run as a credit card, not credited to the account yet. Can we still use those as proof of expenses?
Yeah, so the question.
So I got that one. That was good. So the answer is yes. We all know that a debit card requires the cash to be pulled out. So that would be a incurred and paid expense versus, a pending payment on a credit card.
Okay.
Good question.
As far as identification verification, are we going with the standard CalFresh verifications that we usually use day to day? You can use a pay stub and a social security card, something like that, your process.
Yeah. So we're going to talk a little bit more about verification requirements, but, ooh, I'm echoing, I'm sorry, hold on. Okay. So we're going to talk more about verification requirements. Oh. Melanie, are you all hearing an echo?
No.
Okay, then I'll just keep going even though I hear it on my end. So we will touch on verification requirements, but in general, they are eased during a disaster. So a lot of what you'll see is we verify when we can, but we also use flexibilities that are available to us to ensure that they're able to get an eligibility determination as soon as possible.
Danae?
I have several questions, Melanie. I was wondering on the time frame for requesting the supplement. You mentioned that they'll have 10 days to provide it back, like if they call and ask for the supplement. Is there a cutoff time?
So
no longer be able to request it?
Is that for the supplemental or the replacement benefits? So the question is, if they call and request the supplemental benefits, do they only have the 10 days to request the supplement?
So they actually can only request the supplement during the application period, which is those 7 non-consecutive days. The caveat here is if it's requested by phone, you can provide the client 10 days to return the 303 with a signature. But the request itself has to be received during the application period.
Is that, okay.
So when you say all of Shasta County, is it literally all? So if somebody is coming in from the eastern side, which we know wasn't as affected, and they have some reason why they were affected, they would qualify?
So she's asking if all of Shasta County would qualify, including the eastern part that we know was not affected by the fire?
So technically the answer is yes. The disaster area is the whole county. But remember, that household has to have had an adverse effect. So they may have shown you residency in the disaster area, but there are 3 criteria at the high level: residency, purchasing food during the benefit period, and an adverse effect. So they have to meet all three of those first level criteria to move on to the financial eligibility questions.
Okay.
And then with evacuation expense, how broad is that? So I can give you an example. If I have somebody come in and say we were told we could voluntarily evacuate and we were panicked, we left, and my little one didn't take her shoes, so we bought her a pair of shoes, and that's my evacuation expense. Does that work?
So the question is, they were voluntarily evacuated, and they left their child's shoes, and they bought their child a pair of shoes, and that was their only adverse effect. Would that be considered?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, so that's an adverse effect, but I will tell you, just one pair of shoes may not be enough to bring you below the disaster gross income limit, which we're about to talk about now. So it really would depend on whether that adverse effect, the cost of that pair of shoes, is enough to bring the household under the DGIL, which we're going to talk about.
Okay.
Okay, the last question I had then was surrounding you talked about the AR for an elderly or disabled person has to come in and apply in person, but then the person can do a phone, or did I not hear that right?
The question is that AR has to come in and apply in person, but the elderly and disabled person can be interviewed by phone, or did she hear that incorrectly?
No, so the authorized representative on behalf of the elderly or disabled person has to be interviewed in person. So you could do the designation by phone if that is what you need to do, but the interview itself is completed with the AR in person.
So for those elderly individuals with no one has an AR, is there any exception?
So the question is.
Yeah, I heard that one. So whether there's an exception. So
Right.
This is a ongoing topic with FNS. There currently is not. Now, you could do creative things, but it's difficult with limited resources while you're operating. You could do a home visit. You could have, we've sometimes seen people Skype, but that's not very commonly available. And at this point, there's no general exception allowing for telephone interviews.
Yes.
So if an individual they're in Shasta County, they're affected by the car fire, but then also were evacuated based on another fire that was in the area, and they had disaster-related expenses based on that power going out, would they be eligible to the disaster CalFresh?
So the question is, they were affected by the car fire during the benefit period, and then they were evacuated by another fire or affected by another fire in Shasta County. Would they be eligible for those expenses as well?
So I am going to say yes, because they have the initial impact from the car fire, and I'll be very transparent with you all. How would we even begin to explain to someone that other fire doesn't count?
Okay.
Do they have to have that initial impact from the car fire? Or if, say, the Proration fire, and that was the only one that impacted them, can you still cover that?
The question is, do they have to have the adverse effect from the car fire as of July 23rd, or can they have been affected by the Bernie fire, the Pat fire? Only the Bernie fire.
So technically the answer is they have to have been affected by the car fire during the benefit period, and they have to have been a resident on July 23rd. So technically it is tied, our current operation is tied to the car fire.
Okay. Yes.
clients tell me that they've been told not to eat the food they were growing in their backyard garden because it's toxic. Is that a food loss we can work with, or? So
the question is, there's been people told not to eat the produce that they have been growing in their garden due to the ash that has fallen on their produce. Would that be considered a loss of food?
Yes. And remember, that means you passed kind of level 1, you have an adverse effect, and then we would move on to determine your financial eligibility.
Okay. Yes. What if they have a pending CalFresh application? Would they be eligible to apply for?
Yes. This is a good question that came up in other counties as well, and it's sort of, we're in a timing pickle, because if that application is pending and you were to process it, they would receive CalFresh, but they wouldn't have received it during the benefit period. So you're sort of doing two things. You're processing disaster CalFresh for July 23rd through August 21st, and then you're issuing regular CalFresh once you finish processing that application, which would be after, August 22nd. So you could do both, but you kind of have to keep those organized in your mind, that you're looking back for disaster CalFresh and then you're looking forward for regular CalFresh.
Okay. I think we.
Okay.
Hold on, we got one more question.
Okay.
On that a little bit more, and how we're separating the applications with disaster CalFresh. If someone applied yesterday, expedited, I've already granted them. They can still apply for disaster CalFresh because they were.
Okay, so the question is, a client came in on the 16th, applied for expedited CalFresh. They've been granted. Can they come in and apply for disaster CalFresh?
So they will be granted for August
expedited
benefits?
Yep.
So they would get 2 benefit types. Yes, let me, though, get you some information, Melanie, on sequencing. I'm going to write this down, because we might actually have, that might present an issue with C4, because you have 2 benefit types at one time.
Okay. We'll
because
take that
of the
offline.
overlap. Yep, but I'll put that here, and we have old responses and email on that too.
Okay, so I'll have to get that back with you on that question.
Regarding the CF303 and the replacement benefits, it seems that those have been coming in since the start of it, but you're talking about the period during the disaster, 7 days. Can you clarify? Maybe I'm just misunderstanding.
Sure. No, this is a great question, because the 303 does a variety of things. So you can use the 303 to issue replacements today. You can have someone come in who says, I need to have some of my benefits replaced. Then that same person can come in during the application period and tell you that they would like to apply for a supplement, and they would, again, use a 303. So it's the same form for different purposes.
So would that just depend on the date received?
I'm sorry, Stacy.
Would that depend on the date received for that form then, as to how we process it?
So the CF303, it would depend on the day received on to how we would process it?
Because they can only request.
Well, so it depends on whether you're receiving a singular request for replacement, a singular request for supplements, or I guess it would be possible that on the same day, an ongoing household would tell you, I need both. I need a replacement because I had a power outage, and I need a supplement because it happens to be August 23rd. So they would fill out both sections of the 303 on the same day.
Aren't we only doing the replacement through the 21st in our county though? And then for the supplement for starting it during the disaster period, which after that date, correct?
So she's asking, since we're only doing the replacements through the 21st,
Right.
but
No.
they wouldn't be able to do a request for supplements on the 23rd.
So I believe that okay, you're right. Your timely reporting waiver only goes till the 21st. So, right, for the car fire, you don't have overlap. So that's good. So you would not have that scenario where you double up.
Right. Yes.
What if somebody's having benefits? I think I already know the answer to this question, but I want clarification. What if somebody is having their benefits reduced because of an overissuance?
So the question is, what if somebody is having their benefits reduced by an overissuance?
That's a great question. We do the supplement from the pre-reduction amount.
So it would be the benefit amount before the overissuance is deducted.
Yes, if your benefit amount is $150, it's being reduced by 10%, so it's technically $135. We would supplement you from $150 to the max for a household of one, $192.
Okay. Yes.
So normally, before we issue a supplement, we have to check the QSU to make sure there's no overissuances. Is that the case here, or are we just right now?
So the question is, do we need to check with our QSU, which is our unit that we check with for overissuances, prior to issuing a supplement for disaster CalFresh?
Can you tell me a little bit more about why you think you might? Because
basically what we would do is if a client is paying an overissuance prior to issuing a supplement, we would check to make sure the client wasn't needing to pay an overissuance prior to paying the supplement, because the supplement could be used to offset the overissuance.
Okay. So disaster CalFresh benefits cannot be used to pay an overissuance. So no, you would issue the supplement and you could not credit that toward an OI.
Okay.
And that it applies if they are existing CalFresh getting a supplement, or if they were previous CalFresh, not any longer, but they're still paying off that OI, and they come in and then they apply for disaster CalFresh, they can't take that disaster CalFresh to pay back the old overissuance.
Okay. Yes.
Regarding the pending application, so say a client has a pending ask that's been interviewed but not granted, and they come in and apply and are eligible for disaster CalFresh, does that change the beginning date when we do the regular eligibility determination? Is there maybe an overlap?
So the question is, a client has a pending CalFresh application. They've been interviewed but not granted. They come in and apply for disaster CalFresh. Would the application date need to be changed for the regular CalFresh application because of the potential disaster CalFresh lap?
No. So the disaster CalFresh benefit is for the benefit period. So you are giving them it's kind of weird. You're like giving them a retrospective benefit for July 23rd through August 21. And so the regular CalFresh is a prospective benefit looking forward. And so you can avoid some overlap there. It wouldn't be duplicate issuance.
Okay. Did that answer your question, Patricia?
Even if the application date is within the disaster CalFresh?
She's asking even if the application date is within the benefit period?
That's where we're going to provide some clarification.
Yeah, she'll
Right.
get back with me on that clarifying issue. Okay, if there's no other questions, we're going to press forward.
Okay. So now we've talked about some of this basic eligibility criteria, and we're going to dig in now into what information you need to determine financial eligibility. So I am presenting to you on this slide the Disaster Gross Income Limit, or the DGIL. So this is unique to Disaster CalFresh. It is one of the places where we have the most variance from our regular CalFresh income eligibility determination. So this is an important section here. What the DGIL does is it groups income and resources together under one test. So this is completely different than what we do for regular CalFresh. As you can see, what you need to do is add the total take-home income during the benefit period. So again, July 23rd through August 21st, the total take-home income during that period, add that to resources available during that period, and then you subtract disaster-related expenses. And that is how you determine whether the household meets the disaster gross income limit. When you're calculating the DGIL, the most important thing you need to do is avoid double counting income and resources. So our advice for how you can do that is to first determine resources or cash on hand on the first day of the benefit period. So on July 23rd, any cash available to that household, consider that available liquid resources. And then anything received after that during the remainder of the benefit period, consider that income. And you're going to add those two things together. The benefit period is not a straight 30 days. It's not a straight calendar month. It is 30 days, but it's not a calendar month. So you're going to see some nuance in, for example, a July check from a job that was received on July 1st. The total amount of that July check is not going to be available to the household. They're going to have spent some of it. So you're asking them on July 23rd how much of that check was left. That plus other money in bank accounts and cash on hand, that's going to be your resources. Then any income received after that, for example, your next check on August 1st, that would be your income. So you have to combine those two and then subtract disaster-related expenses. So we're going to go through each of these little bubbles one by one. So income, it is the total take-home income paid to household members. The key phrase here is take-home pay, not gross pay. So this is what is available to the household in terms of earned income. It includes wages received after all payroll withholdings. It includes public assistance payments or other unearned income and any self-employment income. The next bubble is accessible liquid resources or cash on hand. So you're going to include cash, funds accessible in checking or savings accounts, and it does not include retirement accounts, disaster insurance payments, assistance received or expected to receive during the benefit period, and any payments from federal or state, local government agencies, other disaster assistance payments. Those are not considered resources. Okay, this is a note, and there's a big red circle here because you should not include any inaccessible liquid resources. So remember we talked about the rare occurrence where cash would no longer be available to the household. For example, the bank is closed and they can't get to the ATM, they cannot get to online banking, or maybe their home burned down and so they lost cash. That cash is not accessible and should not be included in the disaster gross income limit calculation. So once you have added the total take-home pay and liquid resources, you need to subtract the disaster-related expenses. As we have already discussed, these expenses include expenses that the household has paid or expects to pay out of pocket during the disaster benefit period. So incurred and paid, not simply incurred. And please note, if a household has received or anticipates to receive reimbursement for the expenses during the disaster period, which would probably be pretty rare, it's not deductible. And I say rare because the speed in which reimbursements are provided is usually not that quick. And we've already talked about that credit card issue, so that has been highlighted as well. Okay, so because things are never really completely easy, we're going to hit pause and we're going to discuss the issue of income proration because it will have an effect on your calculation for the disaster gross income limit. So we've already talked about the fact that excluded household members may be eligible for disaster CalFresh. Those excluded household members whose income has been previously prorated, their income can again be prorated to establish DCalFresh eligibility. So the chart in the slide that's in front of you, we have this from our friends in Ventura County who kept this handy during their operation of DCalFresh. And as you'll see across the top, they have some common reasons for exclusion, and then they have a quick reference for whether the income will be counted for disaster CalFresh or not. So a good example here is an ineligible student's income. They're an excluded member. Their income was also entirely excluded. There was no proration, so you can count the entire student's income toward the disaster CalFresh household. Another common example, and we're going to go through a scenario here, is a non-citizen. Now in this case, the non-citizen member was excluded from the household, but their income was prorated and applied to the other eligible household members. So therefore, you would prorate when determining DCalFresh eligibility. So let's go through that example because I think it might be relatively common. A previously excluded father's income was prorated in the past to determine the eligibility of the ongoing CalFresh household, which includes the mother and 2 children. The father's income was may be prorated to determine his eligibility for DCalFresh as a household of 1. So the ongoing CalFresh household, the mother and the 2 children, they are eligible for a supplement, if not already at the maximum, for a household of 3. And the father, DCalFresh proration allows for that income to be applied to his household of 1 to determine disaster CalFresh eligibility. So I'm just going to wrap up by going through this just one more time. Your take-home income plus your liquid resources minus disaster-related expenses must be less than or equal to the gross income limit. So what is that limit? Here we have it. So these are the disaster gross income limits by household size. Keep in mind, every household under the DGIL is going to receive the maximum allotment for their household size. There is no variance. So a household of 3 that is significantly under the DGIL will receive the same maximum allotment as a household who's under the DGIL by $2. There is no difference in the disaster CalFresh allotments, and again, that is for administrative ease. So I stopped here last time, and Melanie, we can do the same if there are questions specifically related to the disaster gross income limit before we jump to verification.
Yes.
Do we include unearned income like SDI or Social Security benefits?
Do we include unearned income like SDI or any of the other types of unearned income?
You do, if it is received during the benefit period. And because the benefit period is a little weird, the same example about July 23rd, you may only have a portion of your previous payment available. That's going to be counted as a liquid resource. And then your next payment, which maybe comes in after August 1st, that's going to be income, and you're going to add those two together.
Okay.
How about student loans or overpayment for student loans?
Student loans or overpayments for student loans.
I'm not sure about an overpay, what that refers to, an overpayment. Is that, are you saying like?
A loan, so it covers a loan received by the student that covers, the payment is more than the tuition, and they would receive the overpayment from them.
Oh, so he's
okay.
talking about like a disbursement.
Yes.
From
so
a student loan.
That would be considered a liquid resource that was available to you if you had any of that overpayment left during the benefit period. So this is cash that you can use to cover your expenses during that time.
Yes.
What about income that's typically excluded from the CalFresh household?
Income that what?
That's typically excluded from.
Oh, income that's typically excluded from a household income for CalFresh.
So this is where the guidance gets really tricky because this program operates off of a 40-page handbook. It's not as extensive as our regulations. So the disaster CalFresh guidance does not have income exclusions typically. We reference some of the resources, or I forget which slide it is, that you don't need to count, like your retirement account is not something that you can just pull from and make cash quickly. But otherwise, there are no income exclusion rules for disaster CalFresh.
Okay. I'm not seeing any more questions,
okay.
So we can push forward.
Okay. So now let's discuss how you can verify some of these household circumstances. And I want to start just by emphasizing that the verification requirements are eased during a disaster CalFresh operation. So you'll notice that they're quite flexible in comparison to our normal verification processes. And I know that can be tough because we've trained very strictly on verification, but we do have some flexibilities here that we normally don't. So the verification requirements are 3-tiered. Identity must be verified. Residency or loss, inaccessibility of income or resources should be verified where possible. Household composition and food loss can be verified if questionable. So the availability of verification is going to vary depending on the household circumstances, but we do have a chart where we walk through some of these requirements and the flexibilities that we have. So on this next slide here, as I mentioned, identity verification is required, and that is for the applicant. And what specific documentation we use to do that is where we have some flexibility. Photo ID, other 2 documents that verify identity and residency, you can combine those. So things like library cards, medical cards, you know, if you have it, birth certificate, you can bring that in. As well, you can, if you must, have a signed affidavit from a collateral contact, or even do the collateral contact by phone to attest to the identity of that person. So if those other sources aren't available, there is some flexibility here. For residency, it's when possible and practical, and most times residency is one of the easier things to verify. So as you'll see here, we have some options like your driver's license, other ID with address, mail that you've received at a address in Shasta County, utility bills, tax bills, basically anything that would establish the applicant's home or work address. And we talked a little bit about using some flexibility on work. You can ask someone, where they worked, where is that place located, and if they provide sufficient information, then that would suffice. Because again, you're verifying residency when possible and practical. Household composition, only if questionable. So as you're asking those questions about who you live with, children's birth dates, ages, and If it doesn't seem questionable, the person's pretty consistent about who's in their household, you can move forward. But if there's any reason to question household composition, you could request verification if you need to. For a loss of income or resources being inaccessible or what resources the person has on hand, here, this is when possible, and this is a big variance from how we usually verify income. So again, if it's possible to verify, you're going to do that. So if the person happened to bring wage stubs with them, they have their bank statements, you can tell, you know, how much they're receiving from direct deposit. Go ahead and verify that. But if it's not possible, you're going to use some flexibility here to use existing databases or even take client statements. What we're trying to avoid is having folks come in, try to apply, and because something is not available at that moment, sending them away because they may not come back, and we have very tight timelines for issuance. So we are trying to use this flexibility as often as possible. For food loss, again, only if it's questionable. You know, you can use some of your power outage maps and other information you know about the possibility of food being lost to verify that, unless it does seem that it's likely or very unlikely. This came up on the last call training, so I'll just jump ahead a little bit to say that Disaster CalFresh does not have its own verification request and return rules. So, you know, normally we would send out a CW2200 and provide the client a certain amount of time to return those verifications, but that standard of practice does not exist for Disaster CalFresh. So we've seen in other counties households sent away with a clear instruction for what they need to bring back, and we let them know that because we only have 7 days to process questionable applications, and really we're trying to do all of them in 3 days, they do need to come back with that verification relatively quickly and no later than the 7 days, because I simply cannot process their application after that. So that did come up on the last session. I touched on this already, but we'll just come back to this to clarify. Counties must ensure that Disaster CalFresh benefits are made available as soon as possible and no later than 72 hours after application, again, as often as possible, except for questionable cases in which you could delay issuance up to 7 days. Now, questionable may include kind of a broad range of things, but if, for example, an interview was scheduled but not completed, you could put that application into the questionable bucket and get yourself some additional time to process. Also, if you've requested those verifications that they have not been provided, or if, as you are conducting the interview, information provided by the household doesn't necessarily match up with what is known to the county about the disaster. So an example would be a household attests to major home damage due to the fire, but you know that the neighborhood was outside of the fire area. So it's kind of questionable that they would have experienced major fire impact. As well, a household previously denied, so a household that applied during the application period was denied and returns to apply again may be considered questionable. This is not to say that the household circumstances may not have changed in that short period, but because it's unlikely, you should just take the time to really carefully assess that those changed circumstances did indeed happen in that very limited window of time. And for this operation, we will be issuing Disaster CalFresh benefits on regular EBT cards since you are operating out of your offices. Okay, and then just to wrap up here, this is my last slide. Recently, just this week, coincidentally, the Federal Food and Nutrition Service did issue guidance on ensuring Disaster CalFresh access for the elderly, persons with disabilities, and other vulnerable populations. So I've added this here just as an important reminder that as with regular CalFresh, the ADA and other laws require that the county provide equal access, including the provision of reasonable accommodations when possible. So in addition to the ADA, we want to make sure there are special provisions in general for elderly and people with disabilities to ensure that they are safe and comfortable. So specifically, we often will experience large crowds and long lines for disaster CalFresh. You just want to keep an eye out as you're working that day. If you know, there's an elderly person who's been in line for quite a while and they really do need a seat, to try to accommodate them with a place to sit, or possibly even prioritize them for service, just because there have been some issues in other states where elderly and disabled people, because of the wait, have had some negative impacts. The county should provide meaningful access to disaster CalFresh applicants who are limited English proficient, you know, through the use of bilingual staff, interpreters, and translated documents. And I will just say, your disaster response team has stepped up to get all the outreach materials translated very quickly into some common languages for Shasta County. So we are doing better than we have before ever on this area of ensuring access. So we just want that to continue. And really trying to make the application experience as comfortable as possible for folks. We know that the crowd and the long line can make it a challenge, but the purpose of this slide is just to highlight it and, you know, keep this top of mind, that we want to make this, you know, at least a negative experience, particularly for some of those vulnerable populations. So with that, I am ready, or we are ready to take any questions and answers that the room has.
Jean?
I have two questions. The first one is for verification purposes. Can we use the work number?
I didn't.
Can we use the work number?
Can we use the work number for verifications?
Yes, you
income?
can. Yes, that's actually a great tool. We use it in Ventura and Santa Barbara. It allows you to do same-day service, and you get a good verification.
And your second?
My second question is, you spoke about areas not affected by the fire, so it can be questionable. My question is, there's smoke everywhere in Shasta County, so people that have had medical expenses due to that, would that be an adverse effect?
Yes.
So the people, okay.
Okay.
Yes, things like respirators, you know, masks, even, I mean, some people have left for evacuation and then need additional medical equipment or prescriptions that are at home. So all of those, yes, would totally be allowable.
So a follow-up to that, what about hospital visits? The hospitals here have seen an increase in people with breathing problems. Would the hospital expense qualify?
Yes, the hospital expense would be, I'm trying to go back to the slide, in the category of, I believe it says, medical expenses. It says due to personal injury, but that's more expansive. You had a breathing issue, you have to go to urgent care, and you have a bill, that would be allowable. Oh, I should correct myself. Not just a bill, but a bill that you paid, just to correct myself.
Janae?
I have a few questions again. So the residency proof is tied to just anywhere in Shasta County, not necessarily where you were affected. I'm just thinking because a lot of people provided I need to have a full Shasta County address. So.
Okay, so the question is, residency has to be provided, but they have been providing an old Shasta County address today.
Yeah.
So if it's questionable, we can ask them for proof.
Yeah, if for whatever reason you think it is questionable, maybe you actually, like, you live in the neighborhood, you know that person doesn't live at that household address anymore. Yes, of course, you can further verify. I will just say that you will not be able to know everything for certain all the time, just like with regular CalFresh. So what our direction is, you're using the best available information at the time, and to a certain extent, your gut to determine if something is questionable or not. And I know that that gray area is really difficult. It's much easier when it's black and white, but we won't be able to have, you know, exact clarity on that something is absolutely true in all circumstances in this working environment, because it is a lot of applications in a short period of time with a quick issuance cycle.
So if there's a household claiming a food loss because they accommodated an evacuated family, would that be an adverse effect? Like, in other words, they fed a family that was evacuated, so that was why they're claiming a food loss.
Did you hear that, Alexis?
I did. So normally, just evacuating from FNS's perspective does not mean that you lost the food, because according to them, when you come back, the food is still there. Now, if you were gone for a long time and the perishables in your refrigerator spoiled, yes, there might be some food loss. So I can't say, 100% of the time evacuation means food loss, but it can mean food loss.
So her question was, if the family is feeding another family who was evacuated due to the car fire, would that be considered acceptable food loss?
I would consider that more a disaster-related expense. And yeah, and even that, I don't know that I have ever heard, I'm not saying it's not possible, I don't know that I have heard someone claim that as an expense, but it seems possible.
So it would not be a food loss, it would be more of a disaster expense.
Yes.
Right, if you take in guests and you have to make special trips to go buy more food to feed those guests, that is an expense that you would not have incurred had they not showed up. So I think that's acceptable.
They can't be in your house, though.
So, so let me clarify. So if they had taken the evacuated family in their home, we would not consider that family's loss, food loss, but we would consider it an adverse action food expense, a disaster expense.
Yes, you can consider it a disaster-related expense. And remember, the people who are staying in that household temporarily are not part of the disaster CalFresh household, because the disaster CalFresh household composition is specific to how it existed on July 23rd. So if a client was in front of me and they claimed that as an expense, I would actually recommend that the family that is staying with them also consider applying for disaster CalFresh, because they're not going to be able to maximize their eligibility unless they apply as two households.
Correct. And that, okay.
So if a customer is not able to provide a social security number, are we requesting that as a verification, or do we need it?
So this is a very important point. Social security number is not required for disaster CalFresh. You will see that the disaster CalFresh application does not ask for social security number.
And then my last question again was, so if you want something, are we using a 2200 or are we putting it on something else? Or just verbally telling them?
So it's a question again about the 2200.
Right. So Melanie and I are going to discuss that option offline, because there is no disaster CalFresh specific request for verification document. So we'll have to talk through whether we can use the regular CalFresh 2200.
Okay, we only have about 15 minutes until we have to end the training. So, Jennifer?
For the client statement, if they can't provide their human resources, can you take a verbal, or does it have to be on a sworn statement, written?
So the question was, oh, okay.
Oh, no, I did not get that one. Sorry.
Okay, so the question is for a client statement, do we have to take it on a sworn statement or can we take the verbal statement?
Verbal with adequate case notation.
Okay.
So, and this is the reason you still want to make sure that your case notes or your journal entry, however, I think C4 says journal entry, is adequate is because there is a disaster CalFresh specific case review. It is not a formal quality control review, so it does not, follow the regular CalFresh QC and error rate rules and all that. But in order to assess our effectiveness, we will review a sample of disaster CalFresh cases, and we will be doing interviews with those households. So your case notation will help those reviews be completed accurately. Even if they don't contribute to our quality control numbers, we want to make sure that we're able to provide a full report to FNS. So the case notes are still important for that purpose, even though the cases are not reviewed in the normal quality control sample.
Jana, you had a question?
So, Alexis, I think you kind of already answered it. Basically, the question we had is that knowing there's not going to be case reviews done by our supervisors and workers here, we wanted to know if there was anything specific you wanted to see in the journal. So we have a template that we wanted to send to see if it met kind of what you wanted to see in the case. Can we send that to you after this?
Yes, that would be great. And I think we had some other templates from other counties, I believe, and they did find it helpful to use that approach for consistency. And again, because you're really seeing so many customers and you're processing a lot of applications, if you can standardize any of those practices, it's a great approach.
Okay. Yes, Stacy.
If a household is denied, are they able to request a fair-hearing space?
So the question is, if a household is denied, are they able to request a fair hearing?
Great question. So before I even get to fair hearing, let's just also clarify that denied households have the right to request a supervisory review. So you must provide to them the option for supervisory review on site. And the goal of that is to try to reduce the number of fair hearings because, yes, a disaster CalFresh case can go to fair hearing. It's limited to those that have been denied and or those that want to contest the household size. If a household never applied, they missed the application period, they can't go to hearing and then say they were entitled to disaster CalFresh benefits. So it's limited to people who applied in the application period who were denied or who are contesting the household size.
Back and back. You go. Yeah.
Are there going to be different notes that we have to use or just standard brand line?
The question is, are there going to be different notices that we have to use other than the DFA 390?
Off the top of my head, no, there are disaster-specific notices, and I believe there's the application, the approval, and the denial is combined. So those are the only disaster CalFresh specific forms. And what we saw was easiest was you just have the household walk away with that form. So at the time of the determination, if you do everything same day, give it to them right then so that they don't have to wait for something in the mail.
Okay. Here.
If they request Medi-Cal during the interview, does the CF3 decide what to say to that date, or do we need to do a supplement?
So the question is, if they request to apply for Medi-Cal at the same time as disaster CalFresh, are they allowed to fill out a SAS 1 with the disaster CalFresh worker, yes, or will that be separate?
Absolutely. The feds care nothing about Medi-Cal, CalWorks. They only care about food stamps.
So they can apply for, they can do a
Yes.
SAS 1 with the disaster
Yes.
CalFresh worker. Okay.
Yeah, now, okay, well, this is a tricky dance because the SAS 1 can also be a CalFresh application. So if it looks like they might be CalFresh eligible, just move that application over to another worker so you don't have a conflict.
Gotcha. So if they express if they want to apply for Medi-Cal, you can have them speak to another worker.
That would be the cleanest way to do it.
Okay. And back to Phil.
For applicants that don't have a case in C4, are we creating case model in the industry?
So this is a C4 related, Alexis, so I'll go ahead and take it. For people who do not have a C4 case, when the application is registered, a new case will be started for that individual. So, and then they will, if it is for an excluded member, it will be tied as a companion case. And remember, these are only valid for 30 days. Or no, it'll be registered before. Yes.
So when we go to grant these benefits, is there any review or authorization process, or are we just going to grant them on the spot?
So this is another county one. So that would be something you would need to speak to whoever is doing the process, the supervisors. It would not be something that would be discussed here.
And then is there a potential for any of this to come back to locations?
So the question is, would there be a potential for overissuance for disaster CalFresh?
Unfortunately, yes. In limited circumstances, but primarily for fraudulently issued benefits.
What if it's a county cost?
So if it's what if it's a county cost error?
Let me pull up my little guidebook. I feel like, yes. Hold on one second.
Sure.
This is why I'm going to turn this into a pocket guide at some points in my life, but okay.
Yes, it would be wonderful, Alexis, to have a guide.
So, general, what the feds say on this is, if a household receives disaster CalFresh benefits to which it was not entitled, the county must establish a claim against the household consistent with claims collection requirement and SNAP regulations. So that basically means you're applying existing OI collection procedures to the CalFresh household. So yes, that means you can establish an IPV for fraud, an inadvertent household error, or an agency error. The way that I most commonly see an agency error occurring is if in the review process we discovered that something was done mistakenly on the part of the county, and we would be in touch about that because the state staff does the reviews.
Okay. Do we have any other questions? If not, thank you for attending and be ready for next week. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Good luck and have a nice weekend.